The UK is facing a real cost of living crisis, with inflation rising much faster than wages. But what, if anything, can the government do about this? Well, one of the first policies they could try is lower taxes on energy. So lower petrol tax, lower tax on electricity and gas. And this would have the effect of reducing the cost of living on these essential items for many people. And also it could be temporary. When oil prices go into reverse, in theory these tax cuts could be reversed. And it would make a big difference because these are some of the goods that are increasing the most expensive, and so making them cheaper would have a positive effect on improving living standards. I think the big drawback of lower energy taxes is that these taxes are there for a purpose. They're there to try to combat global warming and encourage us to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And the high price of oil is a signal that we do need to reduce our dependence on energy imports from countries with murky human rights records and seek a way to find alternatives to our high carbon emissions. And a cut in tax is an unfortunate way of regressing on our goals of trying to combat global warming. Now, an alternative strategy would be to give an energy rebate directly to households. And this could be targeted to those who most need it, so perhaps a higher energy rebate for those on the lowest incomes. Now, the advantage of this is that it gives households the freedom of how to spend it. So if they want to use it to spend on higher energy prices and keep buying petrol, then they're quite welcome to do that. But also it retains the incentive to look for alternatives, to reduce unnecessary energy use. And if households are successful in reducing energy use in electricity and petrol, then they will be able to use this energy grant for other areas of spending. So I prefer that method because you get the best of both worlds. You help to reduce poverty, but also you retain the incentives to improve the environment. But I think from a behavioural point of view, there is something quite important in that I feel that when people look at petrol prices and electricity prices, there's a sense that they are too high, the prices are unfair. And so an energy grant may fail to tackle this lingering perception that energy prices are too expensive, even though the net fiscal effect is fairly similar. Another policy could be a general tax cut, lower VAT, lower income tax, and this would have the effect of increasing disposable income, and again, households will be free to use it how they wanted to. And this helps also to deal with a wider cost of living. It's not just energy prices that are rising, but food and rent and ordinary living costs. But all this raises a question. It's all very well talking about cutting tax, government grants, but how do we pay for it? And there are four possibilities. Number one, the government increase other taxes, such as corporation tax. Secondly, the government cut other areas of spending, e.g. defence spending or public sector pay. Thirdly, the government could borrow more. And fourthly, they could encourage the central bank to print more money. But in a time of inflation, that's really off the table, so we won't look into that. So if we look into tax rises elsewhere, then I think this is quite important because the cost of living crisis is not affecting everybody the same. We see quite strong growth in corporate profitability in the UK and the US, and one study suggested that corporation profit in the UK has increased by about 35% since 2020. So some companies are doing very well. And the government have already introduced a limited windfall tax on energy firms, and the scope for more windfall taxes and higher corporation tax rates. I would suggest that the only real concern about this policy is that if you do increase taxes on energy firms, then there may be, or at least the energy firms claim, that this will reduce their incentives to invest in new renewable energy sources. And it may just be a ploy because they don't want to pay high taxes. To what extent can we use government borrowing to solve the cost of living crisis? Well, this is a tricky one because if the cost of living crisis was a temporary issue, then there is scope to increase borrowing for a year and pay it back later. But one problem is that the cost of living crisis may not just be a one-off temporary problem. There's long-term issues such as low productivity growth, slowdown in economic growth, falling real wages for quite a long time. And so to this extent, it makes borrowing not a long-term solution. Another issue with government borrowing is that it depends upon the economic cycle, because higher borrowing and more spending is reflationary. It's expansionary fiscal policy. It helps increase aggregate demand in the economy. And this helps to lead to higher growth, but also inflation. So if we were in a recession with very low inflation, then expansionary fiscal policy would definitely be justified from a Keynesian perspective. Higher borrowing to offset the fall in private sector spending. Now, at the moment, it's a slightly tricky situation because in the UK, growth has been slowing down in 2022, so there is some scope, you could argue, for expansionary policy there. But at the same time, inflation is still very high, 9%, and could rise to 10, 11%. So expansionary fiscal policy could make inflation worse. And in the United States, growth is a bit stronger, so expansionary fiscal policy there could again make inflation worse. Also, you have to look at the long-term implications of debt. Recently, the OBR suggested that national debt in the UK could rise to 350% of GDP in the next 50 years. And this is because of factors like an ageing population, increased demand for healthcare, possibly increased spending on defence and geopolitical events, and also the costs of global warming. So again, that limits the scope for government borrowing. But if we do go into recession, or at least a strong slowdown in growth, then I do believe there is some scope for higher borrowing to provide some of the financial support that is needed, but not all of it. What about cutting government spending in other areas? Well, one of the big areas of government spending is public sector pay. But, of course, this itself is a cause of the cost of living crisis, with public sector workers getting wage increases below that of inflation. So, arguably, you could say there's a need to increase public sector pay rather than cut it further. And with an ageing population and the increased demand placed on healthcare, it's really hard to cut government spending because there's higher demand for healthcare, more demand for pensions, and there's long-term pressures on public finances and sources of revenue, such as falling petrol tax as people go electric. So there's very limited scope for cutting spending elsewhere. What about higher interest rates? Would that help solve the cost of living crisis? Well, we increase interest rates to reduce inflationary pressures. They slow down the growth rate. So in that sense, it could help reduce inflation. But the problem is, while solving inflation, it causes another problem, which is low growth and possibly unemployment. And also, of course, higher interest rates increase the cost of borrowing. So households with mortgages and people with debt would face higher debt interest payments, which again would exacerbate the cost of living crisis rather than solve it. Now, one possibility is to combine expansionary fiscal policy, which increases demand, with tighter monetary policy. So you're trying to have balance between increasing growth with fiscal policy, but preventing inflation with interest rates. So that's a possibility, although in practice it might be quite difficult to achieve. And one thing worth bearing in mind is that the inflation is caused by cost push factors. So interest rates is a very blunt tool because you slow down the growth rate, but you don't tackle directly the rising oil commodity prices. And one thing that is unfortunately the case, that when you have higher oil prices, higher gas prices, it just leads to a worse trade-off. You get higher inflation and lower growth, a kind of stagflation. So whatever choices you would like, we kind of start from a worse trade-off. It's hard to increase everybody's living standards when we have these inflationary pressures. But going back to the big question, how to solve this cost of living crisis, I think it is worth bearing in mind that we can afford it. We can afford to take action. There's a lot of wealth in the country, in both UK and the US, and some people are doing quite well, especially big corporations and people who own several properties, seeing their value go up a lot. So I think imagination can definitely help to solve the cost of living crisis. But at the same time, keep in mind the environmental reasons that we do want to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And keep those incentives to transition to a low carbon economy.